at the center of world power. And I don't exaggerate. I'm talking about world financial power. Here we are at 11 Wall Street, standing in front of the New York Stock Exchange. This, of course, this famous site, this iconic building is known around the world because if you have some saving, or if you plan to have some saving, it's likely that some of your saving is going to end up in equity shares traded on this stock market. The New York Stock Exchange has been the largest stock market in the world for a very long time. It's got a close rival in New York. Number one and number two are the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, the two great stock exchanges. Each one today in this period around $30 trillion of market value of the shares that are traded, the companies listed on these two stock exchanges. If you add in the bonds that are also traded in the New York financial markets, probably the total market value of the stocks that are traded and the bonds that are traded are $80 to $90 trillion. And this is approximately 2/3 of the total market capitalization traded in stock markets around the world. In other words, we're at the very center of world capitalism. And eyes around the world wonder every minute what's happening in the New York Stock Exchange, because people's livelihoods, the future of companies, the future of employment, the future of pensions and retirement income depend on the daily fluctuations of the market value of companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, this is an ancient institution also, not only one of the largest centers of economic power in the world, arguably the largest, but also one of the oldest and most venerable. In New York City, of course, we are in New Amsterdam, so it's a good reminder that the very first organized stock market where shares of stock traded was the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, traditionally dated to its founding date of 1611, just around the time that the Dutch were arriving to colonize the southern tip of Manhattan. And fittingly, the first shares traded on that first organized exchange, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, were the shares of the Dutch East India Company. That's the company that sent Henry Hudson on his voyages of navigation, that led Henry Hudson to discover the great natural harbor of New York, which became the founding of Fort Amsterdam and then the founding of New Amsterdam. After the Dutch established their stock market and they established their early colony here in the southern part of Manhattan, they faced a more formidable rival. In the 17th century, the British overtook the Dutch. The British had their British East India Company, founded in 1600, the Dutch East India Company in 1602. These were the two great rival empires. But during the 17th century, during the 1600s, the British ended up defeating the Dutch in several Anglo-Dutch wars. And in fact, of course, New Amsterdam became New York when the Duke of York conquered this Dutch colony in the 1660s. The Duke of York, the brother of King Charles II, became the namesake of the new city, the British colony of New York City. Of course, New York City in its full modern form would only come into being actually in 1898, when the 5 boroughs of New York, the 5 separate sections of New York, of Manhattan and the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn and Staten Island, were brought together in one overall city in 1898. Well, this center of financial power dates back to the late 18th century, actually to the 1780s and 1790s, because New York was the commercial harbor, it was the port city, it was the financial center of what would soon become the United States of America. Remember that the 13 colonies of Britain on the eastern seaboard of the United States declared their independence from the mother empire, from Britain, in 1776. They had to fight a pretty tough war between 1776 and 1781 to win that independence. They had a little bit of help, by the way. Britain's chief rival in Europe, which was France, gave a hand to the rebellion in North America, and it was the French that gave the military oomph that enabled the defeat of the British during what the United States calls the Revolutionary War. So between 1776 and 1781, the 13 colonies fought for their independence. They won the war, they settled a treaty with Britain, and they established a new weak form of government called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, a confederacy, meant a loose combination of these 13 independent sovereign states. So after the War of Independence, the 13 colonies considered themselves 13 countries. 13 countries linked together in a loose way to do some common things under the Constitution of the 1780s called the Articles of Confederation. It was quite a weak structure because to make almost any move, one needed unanimity of the 13 sovereign states. There was no taxation power of that union. It depended on the tax authority of each of the 13 sovereign states. There was no foreign policy capacity except if all 13 of the sovereign states agreed. There was no executive government that combined all of the states. The executive authority rested within each of the 13 sovereign states. Well, this was tried during the 1780s. It wasn't very successful, as you can imagine. New United States wasn't very united, and when it came to negotiating with Spain, for example, over the rights to use the port at New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River, or negotiating trade agreements with Britain after independence, they couldn't really do it. When it came to tax authority to pay off debts that had been incurred during the Revolutionary War, they couldn't raise the taxation. So the weakness of this very loose confederation became more and more apparent. A brilliant political entrepreneur, somebody who we now call the father of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison, who was a politician and a landowner in Virginia, rallied politicians from across the 13 sovereign states to come together for a meeting in Philadelphia to try to make a new country. And of course, they devised the U.S. Constitution. And what is interesting is it is also in this place, not only the stock market, but over this side of the street, where we have Federal Hall, that new U.S. government came into operation. You may say, but wait a minute, the capital of the United States is in Washington, D.C. It's not in New York. But remember, the first capital of the United States of America was in New York City. In fact, right in the building of Federal Hall. And if you take a look with me at this building, who do you see standing there in sculpture? You see George Washington. the first president of the United States, who became president in 1789. And where did he become president? Well, he gave his inaugural address at Federal Hall, just where we are. This merger of political power and commercial power at this intersection of the New York Stock Exchange and of Federal Hall actually exemplifies the merger of politics and finance that characterized the entire age of European imperialism and the age of the United States as it would become its own empire, first in North America and then an imperial power across the world, a merger of politics and economics. Well, the New York Stock Exchange itself remains headquartered where I'm standing, the largest stock markets in the world, in Wall Street, where we are located right now. Of course, the political power of the United States, the center of the U.S. national government, moved from Federal Hall to a new location in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. And that in and of itself is a wonderful story, because that move from Federal Hall to Washington, D.C. was a negotiated agreement that took place over a famous dinner here in New York City, a dinner that included three gentlemen who had a big role to play in that era. One was James Madison, the father of the U.S. Constitution. The second was Thomas Jefferson, who would become, of course, the third president of the United States and who was the author of the Declaration of Independence and one of the greatest geniuses among the founding fathers of the United States. And he also was a Virginian landowner and aristocrat, but also a scientific genius, an architect, a great scholar, a great lawgiver, a great draftsman, you name it, he did it. And the third of these dinner companions was none other than Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton was the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. And he was the one who had the vision. The United States should become the financial capital. The United States should be a great capitalist country. It should be a great manufacturing country, and it should be home to capitalism in its most dynamic form. And it is those three gentlemen, Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, sitting at dinner in Jefferson's home in New York City, that made a deal. The deal was the following. Alexander Hamilton said, I want a commercial and financial leadership of the new country, the United States. Jefferson and Madison were more agrarian. Why commercial? Why financial? We don't trust the banks. We trust the landed estates. We trust agriculture. So there was already a sectional feud between North and South, actually a sectional feud that had as a subtext a slave-owning South and a commercial economy in the North where there were still some slaves, but very, very few. There was a difference of perception of what kind of country the new United States would become. Would it become an agricultural country of settled agricultural estates and regions, or would it be a commercial, bustling, industrial, manufacturing and financial center as Alexander Hamilton wanted? Well, they debated these things at this dinner. They arrived at a compromise, which is always, I think, a very good thing to do. And the great compromise of 1790 was that Alexander Hamilton would get to implement his financial vision, which included, among other things, the new federal government taking on the debts that had been incurred by the 13 states during the Revolutionary War. So they would assume the debts at the federal level and thereby make a new federal government and a federal or national capital market. And the capital of the United States would not be in Alexander Hamilton's home of New York City, but rather would move south as envisioned by Madison and Jefferson. And so this compromise explains two things. It explains really why the New York Stock Exchange remains here. Hamilton got his way, and New York City became the hub of a national financial market, and then later on, the hub of the world financial system. And it also explains why Federal Hall is today a federal memorial and a museum and not the capital of the United States, because that, of course, was moved under the Compromise of 1790 to the District of Columbia. Now, there's one more point that I'd like to make standing here in front of the New York Stock Exchange, and that is the nature of the capitalist financial system itself. And that is, it's very dynamic. It builds enterprise, it builds industry, and the New York Stock Exchange has certainly played its role in helping to finance the rise of the United States to be the #1 economy in the world. But it's also unstable. It's subject to panic. It's subject to excesses. It's subject to crises. And that's also part of the history of the New York Stock Exchange, because the actual founding date of the New York Stock Exchange is often stated as 1792. And it's stated as 1792 because there was a financial crisis that year. And the financial crisis in part followed Alexander Hamilton's model, because in 1791, under Hamilton's leadership, a new federal bank was established, the Bank of the United States. And the new federal bank lent freely, gave a lot of credit, led to a lot of speculation. And some of the speculators borrowed very heavily to try to corner the stock market that was taking shape in lower Manhattan on Wall Street. And as speculators often do, they got overextended. They couldn't repay their debts. When they went into financial distress, there was a panic in the financial markets here, and it looked like this new financial system might crash. So the brokers from all over the neighborhoods here came together and reached what became known as the Buttonwood Agreement of 1792. Buttonwood meaning a kind of tree, a sycamore tree, which was on Wall Street at the time. They came together and they negotiated an agreement to normalize the trade among themselves so that the rampant wild speculation would be brought into some kind of order. And that Buttonwood Agreement is usually the date that is given for the actual establishment of the New York Stock Exchange. Now, of course, Wall Street has been home to booms and busts. The stock market crash of 1929, which initiated the Great Depression. In our recent times, we can even name a date, September 14, 2008, when the most recent financial disaster occurred, when the then Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, Hamilton's successor many generations later, decided they would close one of the financial institutions that was in trouble in this neighborhood, Lehman Brothers, and they shut it down suddenly, forced it into bankruptcy, and the financial markets panicked in 2008, just as they had panicked in 1792. And once again, there needed to be emergency actions taken to save the financial day, but not before trillions and trillions of dollars of market losses, soaring unemployment, major global economic contraction had taken place. So we're here with the bulls and the bears, Sometimes the markets soar, sometimes the markets crash. This has been core to capitalism from the inception of the modern age in the early years of the 1600s, when the first shares of the Dutch and the British East India Company started to be traded. But I would say that we remain at the center of world financial power to this day, with the size, the liquidity, the weight of the US financial sector still being dominant in the world. We know, however, we're in a new era where many other parts of the world are catching up, where major stock exchanges in Shanghai and in Shenzhen and in Mumbai and in other parts of the world are now also trading trillions and trillions of dollars. We now have a world financial system with major centers all over the world. NYSE, the New York Stock Exchange, remains a preeminent center, but now it is one of many large financial centers around the world.